How's everyone doing? Welcome to Turbocharge Your Portals and Apps, how to build blazing fast portals and apps on SharePoint Online. Is it going to go forward? Nope, not going to advance. It's OK. We can go old school. It'll work this way. So my name is Cathy. I'm a senior program manager on the SharePoint and OneDrive team, focused on the developer platform, really focusing on APIs, how you build great performing apps.
Thank you, Cathy. My name is Shyam Narayan, and I'm a principal program manager on the SharePoint and OneDrive platform team, working on service performance. I've spent more than a decade with SharePoint, where I spent the first 5 years as a consultant, actually building a lot of these large portals with our customers, and the last 5 years on the core engineering team, helping build and run the service.
And I stopped counting how many years I've been working with SharePoint. It started making me feel older than I am. So as we go through, we're going to talk a few things about what we want to do. We're going to think about performance in the cloud. And we're really going to go through 5 great practices for performance, starting with avoiding expensive queries.
How do you optimize static resources for delivery? How do you make sure your end users are not downloading a lot of content?
Really making sure that you're taking advantage of all of the things that are available to you, including leveraging CDNs for managing your content, like images and files.
And then finally, figuring out how to and when to brand SharePoint appropriately. And then we'll wrap the session up talking about how do you roll out portals and apps to your end users. So before we get into things, we wanted to start thinking about how do you go after performance in the cloud. And it's slightly different from what we were used to on-premises. On-premises, if you look at, generally we have a few servers running SharePoint Online. We have probably about 10 servers. The largest SharePoint farms on-premises probably have about tens of servers. And you have your users connecting to these servers with what we call as low latency, high bandwidth connectivity. Most of your users are in your organization in the corporate network. In many cases, the SharePoint farm is just down the hallway or within the building the user is in. And we also have these users accessing a few amount of sites. Most organizations have a couple of portals that they're accessing regularly on a few machines. And what this allows us to do on premises is take advantage of machine affinity and build and leverage local caching. This changes when we go to the cloud. If you think about SharePoint Online, our smallest capacity units, our smallest farms, are made up of hundreds of machines. And we have users who are now not in the corporate network, but spread out globally. And they connect to these farms using the internet. They have to eventually leave the corporate network, go over the internet, and get connected to SharePoint Online. So how users are connecting is very, very important, because we have to make sure that we are tuning our experiences and our design with networking in mind. And then finally, one of the things that happens as you transition to the cloud is we run these machines as stateless compute units. We want to make sure we're able to bring machines quickly online if they fail. At the scale at which we run, machines do fail. We want to make sure when we take machines out, we are able to provide great experiences. And to do those things, we run our machines stateless with no user affinity. So if you came to one of our front ends when we served your request, the very next request, we might send you off to another machine, because that machine could have been taken out for patching or could have failed. And what this results in us not being able to take advantage of those local caches that were available on premises. And there's a set of features that worked great on premises because it took advantage of these local caches. They just do not scale and work great when we move to the cloud. So we'll talk about how to avoid those common pitfalls. So how do we go build large portals on SharePoint Online that are successful, fast, and then end users love it? And I like to think about portals. If you take away all the layers, they're nothing but large websites. And when you build them on SharePoint Online, they are large websites running in the cloud. And building portals in the cloud is no different than building another website in the cloud like CNN.com or Amazon.com. These are large portals that are fast, serving users globally, built in the cloud. And to do these things, all these websites follow a common set of practices and principles and use common techniques. And those same techniques, principles, and tools apply to when you're building portals on SharePoint Online. They're no different. There are a couple of SharePoint-specific nuances, but in general, building portals on SharePoint Online is no different than building portals on any platform, be it PHP, Ruby on Rails, or whatever the next hot thing in town is. It doesn't matter. It's the same set of principles. With that, let's click into what we call a SharePoint Online Rules 101. Right? So we're going to walk you through 5 rules. Many of them are very straightforward. And if you go home next week, and we would prefer if you go home next week, you can apply these to your environment straight away. They're very low barrier to entry, and you will be able to see immediate performance in your portals. Just a quick show of hands. How many of you are running classic portals versus modern portals? So a few hands showing classic. And how many of you are still running on premises and planning to move to SharePoint Online? OK, so a lot of hands go up there. So a lot of these guidance apply. So let's get straight into it, starting with the #1 guidance. Do not use SharePoint structured nav in SharePoint Online. Most portals running on premises leverage structured nav. It's been a great feature which we shipped about 10 years ago. It just doesn't scale in the cloud. It relies on heavy local caching, which we are unable to take advantage in the cloud because of our scaled out services. And when we go look at support cases, when we go meet with customers when they're having performance problem, this is by far the #1 issue we see. Everything else pales in comparison. So if you are running portals today and they're slow in SharePoint Online, make sure that they are not running with structured nav. Or if you are running on premises and planning to move to SharePoint Online, do not lift and shift your portals because you will run into trouble. The alternative is to use what we call as managed metadata navigation. Here we use the taxonomy service to power navigation, and it scales. It's built for the cloud. Or if you don't, you can even roll your own.
Yeah, so when it comes to navigation from an app perspective within a SharePoint site, you have the ability to create your own custom navigation. And some of the things to really keep in mind when doing custom navigation in your SharePoint Online portals is you really want to make sure you're optimizing your calls to that navigation provider. You want to avoid recreating the same problem that structured navigation was creating in the first place. That's going to be searching to give you that information. Don't make those really non-performant API calls through your custom navigation provider. And the other big thing is really making sure that you're following a approved way to create that custom navigation. Don't do DOM manipulation, which is a big thing that we see a lot. And people often call us and say it broke, because that is not an approved way to create a custom navigation component in your SharePoint portals.
OK. So we're going to switch to a demo. I hope all of you like demos. All of you like demos?
You like demos?
OK, good. We can switch back to slides. No.
They didn't seem really enthusiastic about demos. Maybe
let's switch back to slides.
Just go back to slides?
Kidding.
OK.
OK, so I'm going to log into a virtual machine here. So these are performance demos. We wanted to play fair. I'm actually going to be demoing everything off a Amazon virtual machine today, running in San Francisco. And we're going to be going to a SharePoint Online farm on the East Coast. So this is a legit demo. We're not running on Azure. We're not running on Microsoft Network to take advantage of anything. So I'm going to open up 2 browsers and dock them side by side, just to make sure that they're docked correctly. Yep. And what I've done is I've got 2 portals that are identical. I'm going to open up in each browser. And yes, I am using Chrome, because I know a lot of web developers out there use Chrome. So you want to make sure that whatever I show you, it feels familiar. And I'm going to open up these portals, like I said, in both. One's optimized. The one on the left is optimized for performance, whereas the one on the right has got some of the common anti-patterns we see. So I'm going to go ahead and kick off portal B and portal A. Hopefully, the left one comes back faster, and it did. Now, what I'm going to do is just click through the site just to show you what happens. So the one on the right is actually running with structured navigation turned on. I have not made it too
large.
too large so that we don't spend each click 30 seconds and we're waiting at a spinner on the screen. So it's going to be enough to show you how bad it can get. So here I'm just going to click through the sites on both pages. You can see generally as I'm clicking through, sometimes I land on the page that has got the cached version, whereas most of the times the one on the left is faster. What I'm going to do now is actually open up the developer toolbar on both of them so we can actually see what's happening underneath the hood. And I also have disabled the cache. So in this case, it gives us a sense of what the experience would be when a user first time browses your page. I'm just going to click through and see how things go. Oh, I didn't click here, sorry. And you can see that generally the one on the right is laggier than the one on the left. Now I'm going to switch over and show you what's going on behind the scenes. So this is basically us requesting the page, the default.aspx, which is the HTML page coming down. I'm going to zoom in here and walk through what's going on. So in this case, it took 3.9 seconds or 4 seconds basically for the page to come back to the user. We spent nearly 4 seconds on the server trying to render that structured nav. And what happens behind the scenes? In this case, what I've done, I've got 3 sites, each of them having about 10 subsites. We have to go crawl through the entire structure and figure out permissions to generate out the structural navigation for your site. And every time you go to a new machine that's rendering out your page, I have to redo it. So nearly 90% of the time I spent in this case was on the server just rendering out the nav. Whereas if I switch over to the one running manage metadata nav, it's less than half the time. And in this case, I don't have to crawl through the entire structure. We just go out to the manage metadata service, one call, get the data, and render it out.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
So it just gives you a sense, like, if we're cutting time by half, you can even optimize it. I've made sure that it's apples to apples comparisons.
Yeah, and that's kind of what we were talking about. That structural navigation is crawling through every time, basically doing a search of your entire SharePoint environment to pull that back and look at permissions. And so kind of making sure you're not using that same pattern in your own custom navigation.
Yep, switch back. Yep. Yep.
You want to kick us off about portals?
OK, so another common problem we see running is rolling up content, which is very common in large portals. You have a lot of sites. Let's take news as an example. It's buried across different sites. And you write roll-up queries. And a very popular web part or control on premises was the content by query web part. It, again, has a similar problem to the structured nav, where it has to go crawl through your entire site structure, figuring out what content to roll up. It's actually underneath the hood, built on the same technology that structured navigation uses. So works great on premises. When you move it to the cloud, it degrades performance significantly. In addition to crawling the site, we also use XSLT to transform those data to HTML. And that can also be very slow and CPU heavy, slowing your page response times.
Yeah, and from an app perspective, when you're building custom apps to do these same types of query behaviors, you're going to be looking for some of those things like show me my followed sites, give me information about my recent documents, and you're going through and trying to find those kind of complex query positions that are going through. You want to make sure that you're using the right things to build those applications. You want to use Graph whenever possible for your app calls so that you're going out and really truly using our most optimized modern service for APIs. And you want to kind of reduce the amount of calls that you're making whenever possible. And so I am going to actually jump into a demo and show you an app that we've built to perform poorly. Sounds fun, right?
Don't try this at home.
Not going to recommend, not going to share the code, not a great thing to do, really bad. So I'm going to load up a page here. And in this page, I'm going to edit the page. I intentionally did not add this ahead of time because I didn't want the bad performing app to do bad things in my site. So I'm going to go to my web part toolbar, and I'm going to add that custom web part that has been built. And if I come through, you'll see it's actually named bad web part, just so anybody else didn't click on it. And I'm going to add this to the page. And what this web part is doing, it is running a looping infinite loop call to display out all of the lists and libraries in my site collections. And it doesn't close. So it continues to call and render the same lists and libraries repeatedly, over and over and over and over again. And if you happen to notice, it will continue to grow in length as it goes. So you can imagine what this doing of calling repeatedly and rendering in the screen is doing to the performance of my site. And what it's actually doing, again, this is not something you want to do. You want to remember to close the loops. Don't have this infinite loop, because you don't want to get stuck in this pattern of having a web part on your page that is just continually calling out to something. I'm still scrolling. I haven't done anything. It's still adding to this web part. It will infinitely do this as long as the web part is on the page. Just a really bad web part.
And also to add, like, not only does any user of the site now start seeing degradation, but your own local machine starts heating up as well, because it's spinning all these CPU trying to render this continuously. So you have a combination where even your local machine is starting to degrade performance.
Oh, it's getting slower.
I can actually hear the fans go off over here.
I'm not going to save that. OK. So there's a lot of things you want to avoid with building apps for that purpose.
So that brings us to rule number 3. And this is, again, something that we see time and time again. When I'll give you a real story. So my boss is in the crowd over there. I know he's sitting in there. Real story. We had a very large customer reach out to us before their big portal launch, saying, hey, SharePoint Online is slow. We have a portal launch tomorrow. Tens of thousands of users are going to show up. It's slow. And then we got involved, my team and engineering team got involved, and we spent some time digging through what's going on. And what we found was actually not very surprising. It's something we see all the time. We found that the web developer had used really large images as thumbnails on his pages. What they had done, they had used 20 meg images, multiple of them, and scaled it down to small thumbnails. So when the page would load, the user would download all these images, but someone looking at it would be like, these are tiny images. Why is it taking so long? And try doing that from slower networks or remote geographies. You're going to have a terrible performance. And we see this again and again. So the rule over here is make sure when you're building portals, the images and static assets you use are optimized for the web. You reduce them in size. If you have a design team inside the house, they probably provide you with web-optimized images, which you want to use for thumbnails and graphics on the page. Or there are features built into SharePoint that allows you to optimize for the web. Show of hands, how many of you know about image rendition? Ooh, few hands, more than last time, which is great. So image rendition is basically a feature that we shipped probably 3 years ago with our product that allows users and administrators to provide templates to SharePoint on how they want to crop images, and we will then dynamically crop those images and web optimize them for you. We'll show you how to do that. And this is on the classic portals. If you are using modern portals, we have this capability built in. You upload a large image, you drag it onto your page, we will automatically optimize it for you for the web. Want to talk about apps? How do we handle this in apps?
Yeah, apps is one of those really cool things where we can do a lot of harm to a SharePoint portal with our custom apps. And one of the big things that we see people wanting to do is to create things like custom headers, custom footers, and add them into our SharePoint portals. And we give you the ability to do that with SharePoint Framework extensions for the application customizers. But some of the things that you want to do for that is make sure that you're actually optimizing those images by compressing them, or potentially using image sprites if you have multiple images being used in that same component. With With CSS, you can call the same image, so it only has to load once, and then use CSS positioning to display the right part of that image. And so you're really wanting to, as a developer, where we're maybe creating something and we're building out this application that's going to call lots of items to display on the page, make sure that we're doing that in the right way. And so to kind of show you that, I'm actually going to do a quick extension demo showing you a custom header and footer that's been built, and then what that's doing and how it's calling. And again, this one is built not in the right way to try to help showcase this a little bit. So we're going to go back to that same site that we were in before. And one of the things that you may notice is right away I have this header across the top of the page and a footer at the bottom that is calling an image for the moon, right, in the top. An interesting thing about this image, I try not to reload this page too much, because this image is actually 6 gigabytes in size to display 100 pixels, right? So it is a very large image loaded into a document library in my SharePoint site, in the style library, or the site assets library. I can't remember which one I did. And so it is loading in the page. It's going to be cached now because I did load it before, so it will load a little bit faster than normal. But you can see it goes through and calls this image in. So imagine if I was using multiple images in this, or multiple images within my app. Each one of those loads separately. And so you're just calling, and it just is slow to load. So let's take a quick look at this just to see some of the things that I did to make this bad web part, this bad extension. So I have in here just some basic CSS to call this, and one of the things that you'll notice right away is that I'm actually using a relative link to that asset directly in the site assets library, which is not what you want to do as a developer. You want to be putting them into a centralized, compressed location so that they're able to load on demand as needed and not loading in that site every time. When I put it in site assets, it reloads that and pulls it down to put it in that site assets library every time I go to the site. And so this is really simple header and footer extension, but it's doing very bad things to load those two different components in my site. So it's just things that you want to think about as a developer to really go through and build these out in a way that works best to not give your users those negative experiences.
Okay.
Click back in there, find the right place.
And we're back. OK. So that was making sure static assets are optimized for the web. And this applies to even JavaScript, CSS, a whole bunch of other static assets as well, which we want you to make sure are minified in the case of CSS and JavaScript, which is basically taking the file, taking a JavaScript or CSS file, getting rid of all the white space, getting rid of all the formatting. The computer need not read pretty code, but really compressing it down. So when you send down these images, send down CSS files, they are as slim and as tiny as possible. So that was the bits itself. How do we want to deliver these bits? And here's where we want to make sure that you're using CDNs. SharePoint and OneDrive, SharePoint Online and OneDrive for Business, out of the box, serve our static assets using CDNs globally. So we take these static assets and cache them closer to the user, so that when someone from Australia or someone from Asia is trying to talk to their tenant in North America, we're pulling those static assets locally from a server in Australia or APAC or in Asia, and we're just going back to North America for the core data. Really speeds up downloads. So one of the good things we've done, which I believe is super useful, is we've made sure that the CDNs we leverage out of the box for our performance is now available to you for your own assets. How cool is that? You can use SharePoint Online CDNs to distribute your own static assets. And to top it off, it's free.
Yeah.
So please do use it. It's free. There is no excuse why you shouldn't be using it. So what we do behind the scenes is you just, like Cathy showed, you put your assets into a static library, and you turn on enable CDNs for those libraries. I'll show you how we do that. And once that's done, that's about it. We take care of figuring out how to rewrite your URLs when your page renders and you're downloading content from CDNs.
Yeah, and from an app perspective, again, that image that I loaded in that header extension should have been in a CDN. It should have been stored somewhere. And as Shyam said, we have out-of-the-box SharePoint CDNs, but you can also use your own CDN provider when you're building customizations to go out and store those. But with an app, not just images that you want to put in there. You want to put your JavaScript in there. You want to put your CSS files in there. You want to put the assets that are needed in that CDN so that it really optimizes how they're downloaded and used. And one of the big things that we see a lot from an app perspective is people putting unused code assets in that CDN or in their applications. So a lot of times when you're building SharePoint framework components, it gives you a lot of JavaScript and things that you may think you need. I'm going to build this, I'm going to use this fabric component, and maybe I don't use it. You can actually remove those JavaScript assets to really make your CDN smaller, to give your applications less to sort through. So you really want to optimize to remove the unused code that you're not using in your applications in that CDN to really make it better.
And also to add, we also see a lot of customers storing framework JavaScript in SharePoint Online, like jQuery or React or whatever you're using gets stored in SharePoint Online libraries. We strongly recommend instead of using SharePoint to store those framework files, just reference them from public CDNs. They get cached much better because of just everyone in the world's using it.
Yeah, so all those resources that you find online with that jQuery that you paste in and download those jQuery files, you could call those from online. So Shyam, can you show us more about image optimization?
I'm going to switch back to the demo machine, and we're going to spend some time here. So I have two, again, the same machine opened up. I'm going to open up the toolbar, developer toolbar in both, just making sure they're opened up. There you go. And what I'm going to do is just open up the page, let it load up. We probably go full screen, so it's easier to read. If you look at the bottom of the screen, I actually transferred for that page 50 megs of content from the server. Like, it basically required me to download 50 megabytes of content when I rendered the page. I've disabled my cache, so when users first time come to your portal, that's when they make the snap decision of how great the portal is it fast? This is the experience they're going to get. They're going to download a lot of content. Again, I have handcrafted this page. Please do not do this at home. But we see this, and it's unfortunate, but we do see this time and time again, where large images cause you to slow down the download speed. I'm going to go look at a couple of images in here. So for example, drone. You can see it's nearly 13 megabytes to download a drone HD image, and it took 1.2 seconds on the client machine to download this. And I'm connected in from a cloud machine running on Amazon. This got probably state-of-the-art networking, and it's still taking me about 1 minute, 1.5 seconds to download a file. Now, if I go back to the machine that's to the good portal or the optimized portal and redo the same thing, I'm just going to rerun, just refresh my page. I'm going to come back. I'm just going to pick images in this case. And just to show you, I have the same set of images on both. So just to make sure, I've got the same set of images running on both portals here as well. And this is the slow one. It's the exact same images. But the optimized portal, when I go look at it, I've only downloaded 302 kilobytes. It's the same set of images, but I've downloaded orders of magnitude less data to render the same image. If I go into drone, which we looked at previously, there, the 12 meg file or 13 meg file that we were downloading is now 31 kilobytes. And what we're doing behind the scenes, I'm using the same image, but I'm running it through SharePoint's image rendition code, which is compressing the file down and optimizing it for the web. Now, you'll see this funny thing attached to the URL, which says rendition equal to some number, and it's sizing it for me. That's where the image renditions comes into play. I'm also going to open this in a new browser just to show you how it's scaled the image down, whereas this would have been a full bleed image taking over the entire screen. I'm going to close this down and come back to it, but I'll just go to site settings. And here we have image renditions. Under look and feel, you can pick and choose that. And what it allows you to do is create these templates. And templates are nothing but the width and height you want your images to be cropped to, and we figure out what's the right cropping and how to maintain aspect ratio. In this case, I've got two custom renditions. One's called the banner, which is what we used at the top of the page, and one called products, which I use for rendering thumbnails. You can see one's 900 by 170 pixels, so it's the wide one, and the other ones are small images. If I go back to my homepage, and you can see this is loading much faster now because everything's kicking in. And if I go back to that page and scroll down to another image, like drone, I think it was another drone that we used, which is a large image. Oh, I'd have to reload that. Just give me a sec. Once it comes back. Again, the other one was probably a few megs. In this case, it's 5.9 kilobytes. But what you want to look over here is I'm actually rendering out using an image rendition to call out, like, hey, this drone HD, I want you to use rendition number 8, which is my thumbnail rendition. So please crop it for me using that rendition. Whereas the drone HD, I'm setting it to use rendition number 9, so it uses the banner rendition. If you're using the image web part in SharePoint Online, it'll allow you to pick which rendition you want to use. But if you're a developer trying to handcraft your own URLs, you need to pick and choose which renditions you're using. So that's just renditions. Now what I want to do is show you how we are transferring data using CDNs. So if I go back to the bad portal this time, and I'm going to reload the page so we get some fresh network traces. And I'm going to go into image, and let's look at drone. In this case, like I said, it took 1.32 seconds. I'm going to the SharePoint server in this case to download the file. So just keep that in mind, 1.32 seconds to download that. If I switch back to the good portal in this case, and if I hover over the URL, you can see that the URL points to a funky CDN location. In this case, what's happening is those assets, those renditions are not only generated on SharePoint, but also offloaded to the CDN. And then the pages are now pulling down those assets from the CDN. I'm just going to go quickly refresh this page just to make sure that we have the right numbers. OK, there you go. That took 8 milliseconds to pull down from the CDN. Something that took 1 minute, 30 seconds to come down from SharePoint server because it's downloading the full image and it's big, in this case has been compressed down, offloaded to the CDN, and it's coming down in 8 milliseconds. And I have more of those, and you might say, yeah, that's a bigger image. Let's look at images that are comparable. So I've got, switching back to the bad portal in this case, I've got a bunch of logos which are in the 2 to 4 kilobyte range. So these are apples to apples comparison, and you see they're anywhere from 100 milliseconds all the way up to 500 or 600 milliseconds to download from the server. I have the same files even on the good portal, and you look at them, same sizes, but they're much, much, much shorter to come down. So when you are building such scenarios where you've got a lot of images on your page, offloading them off to CDNs will allow you to streamline those downloads fast. You're not going to be blocking on the client, you're not waiting, and you're able to take advantage of global distribution of the CDN. So please do take advantage of this capability. Just before we switch back, how do you enable it? So basically, it's PowerShell. You go load up the SharePoint Online PowerShell module, connect to your site. I've connected to my good site in this case, and I've just enabled CDNs on my Contoso intranet site. By default, it'll enable it for any asset that's been put into the master page library, the style library, or the client-side assets. You put static resources into those libraries, we will automatically offload it into CDNs. In this case, I actually put my resources into a different library where I wanted to control all my published assets, and I've been able to just enable that to go after the CDN. You also get a chance. So CDNs, we have two options. I want to make sure this question comes up, so I'll touch on it before we move on. We have two options for CDNs. By default is what we call as public CDNs, where any asset we put on to the CDNs are publicly accessible. So if you do have sensitive static assets, please do not use the public CDN option. We have an option called as the private CDN option, where we use authentication and you need to be authorized to access this content. So if you have sensitive content in your organization that you do want to use CDNs for, use the private CDN option. Now, I'll show you another really cool thing before we switch. I'm going to go into this page and hit Edit. And this is where the CDN infrastructure really comes into play. So I have a content editor web part over here. How many of you like the content editor web part? It's a long stay of SharePoint. I can see a few hands there. And if I'm going to go edit source, not that one, scroll down and go edit source on that. And it's basically a bunch of HTML that I've handcrafted to render out recent products and recent news. If you scroll in here, all I've got is just a relative path to the file that's hosted in my document library. I don't know the CDN URL. I just said, here's the SharePoint library where that file is stored. SharePoint, take care of it. But what we do at runtime, so when we're requesting the page, we actually rewrite those URLs automatically to point to the CDN locations. So all you need to do is enable CDN support using PowerShell against your site, use the right relative URLs, and you're good to go. We will, at runtime, automatically rewrite those URLs. How cool is that? Okay, you can switch back.
So we wanted to talk about number 5 being one of the most common pitfalls. And I know, Shyam, you've seen this a lot, right? Branding. How many of you have custom branding in your portals? Right? In your classic portals, a lot of times that is what caused down that slowdown of how your pages are loading. We're not using CDN. We're not using image sprites. We're building really complex customizations. And the 5th rule that we want to highlight is that we do want you to change the look and customize where needed in your modern portals. And with that, we've built a lot of great features out of the box that you can utilize to begin that customization, as well as we've built a number of scenarios with SharePoint Framework and extensions where you can take that even further. And some of these just making sure that you are using themes for colors and pulling that through and really applying those where needed. They're able to be applied to your tenant, to your site, and stored in that change the look panel. So it really makes it something that SharePoint knows well how to call and render in the site. Headers and footers. We have header and footer options on the majority of SharePoint modern pages so that you can go through and really go out and customize the way that your sites look. Navigation, again, we talked a little bit about structured navigation in the beginning being something we don't want you to do. That's not an option in the modern SharePoint experiences. You're going to be able to use lots of different navigation options in there depending on what you're doing, with Mega Menu being our newest one that released that really does a lot of what people were doing with structural navigation for you. Then we have the ability for you to customize it even further by using page templates and creating your own page templates so that right within SharePoint, I can build a page and say, I want this to be a template that others in my organization can build a page or a news post with. Then beyond that, we even have it further where you can create site designs that become reusable. So I can build out my site and say, I want it to be a HR site. I want it to have a list of conference rooms or resources, and you can build that out in a site design and reuse it so that every time you need to build that particular HR site, you have that design pre-done. And then lastly, we have our site provisioning service, which is a new service that we've got out in beta right now where you can utilize our SharePoint lookbook templates to give you a head start into building those really nicely branded custom portals and really taking it that final step of the way through and building some really cool custom portals. So there's a lot of great options, and then you saw me demo with that bad header, but they have the option to use SharePoint Framework to build extensions that are application customizers that allow you to do things like create your own header and footer to put in SharePoint Online. And so you can really start to combine things together to give you that custom feel that you utilized in your classic portals in modern portals right away. I know you've got some horror stories on
Lots of horror stories. You can have a chat after the session. Do you want to summarize?
Yeah. So as we want to kind of go through and kind of reiterate our kind of SharePoint rules. Again, as I just mentioned about navigation, don't use structured navigation is really a big one that we want to make sure that we reinforce to you. It is something that a lot of people have used over the years, especially if you're moving from on-premises to modern and in the cloud, or you're moving from classic to modern. Structural navigation is not something you want to continue moving forward with. You want to utilize one of our other options.
Don't use bad queries. Like, keep it simple. Do not use content by query web paths. Use content by search instead, which leverages search underneath the hood to render your queries. It's what powers the modern news scenarios. So if you do want to roll up content in your classic portals, use content by search. It takes advantage of a search infrastructure. And to top it off, it uses what we call as client-side rendering. So you're using the latest JavaScript libraries to do client-side manipulation of the data, so you can control it with more granularity.
Do compress your images and use image sprites and scripts. So take those images, those big images, make them smaller, get them as smaller as you can. Take your scripts, compress them together, put them in CDNs. You saw how easy it is to configure a CDN, even how to make a document library in SharePoint a CDN so that it does help with that page load performance. Keep in mind, our users are accessing from their home internet, from the corporate internet, from their phones in many cases. We want to make sure that the amount of data they're having to download is as small as possible to take advantage of every bit of bandwidth that they're getting.
Yeah, again, just to reiterate, it's available, it's free, please do use CDNs.
Yeah, and then follow the modern branding practices. We have a lot of great tools out there as you're moving to modern to really customize your portals and make them look the way that you want and to keep them really fast. These are all features that have been optimized so that they do not slow down the way that our portals are built.
So Cathy, you showed this demo. I think a lot of you would be wondering. She showed the demo, the bad header extension that kept going for never stopped. How do we protect against such bad code? People do write bad code unknowingly, and we want to make sure that that bad code didn't take down SharePoint Online or didn't take down servers on our side, because it could be affecting a lot of other customers. So how do we handle that?
Yeah, so a lot of people how many of you have heard somebody say, or maybe you've thought it yourself, I think I'm being throttled? Anybody heard that phrase? Yeah? So I want to show you quickly from an API perspective what that actually looks like for our users, and to give you a few tips about how you can do that when you're building apps, not just to see what your users would see if they were being throttled, but also for how, as a developer, you can take advantage of tools that we have, quick and easy ways to optimize your apps if they do get throttled. Yeah. So I want to take a quick look. We're going to jump back into our browser here. Come on, I did click on you. And then one of the things I have here, I have just a simple API call out to the root of Drive, and you can see it returns some information there about that. It gives me a lot of kind of XML. It gives me the ID, created date and time, the data type, all of this different information that as a developer, I may be looking for something in there. That web part that we had that was calling infinitely was actually doing a search query, and it didn't stop. We looped it so that it infinitely looped. This is just giving me information about the root of my drive, and you'll see it's actually, when you're looking at API calls, one way to know that this is a good API call to make, for us, it is that v2.0. This is actually a graph call, and so it's really nice to be able to see that designation right away. Now, this is all great, and I can see the data that's being returned here, but if my users are being throttled on this call, what in fact would they see? And so really easily, by appending the end of this call with a question mark, test 429 equals true, and then I hit return, it's going to take me to this something's not right page. Right? So my users are going to see a visual cue that something is not right there. This is a visual indicator of a different page saying that something has caused this to not work. Now, as a developer, I can use this in a console app to really see what that response header comes back and tells me what to do. And it's going to tell you to stop and pause. And when it says stop and pause, it really wants you to stop making all of your API calls for a 2-minute window and really have your application wait and then retry again. So if you hear a lot of times I'm being throttled and a user's maybe saying that or somebody saying, I really think I'm being throttled, you do have a way to kind of start testing some of that, or now you at least know what some of those experiences look like. It is going to give the user something telling them that it is unavailable.
And just to add a couple of things, throttling is, the limits for throttling is set at such high levels, it's essentially to protect the platform. You saw, like, real life story, I'll give you a real life story as well. We've had a case where recently one of our customers were testing a feature out, and they were running into throttling. And we called them up and we said, you are making a lot of calls, which is not humanly possible. What's going on? They were like, oh, we didn't know we were testing some new thing out, and they had a bug, and they had a bunch of users hammering SharePoint Online, and our protection had to kick in to make sure other users who are using the shared infrastructure continue to have a great experience, right? So that's where throttling is, to make sure that we don't let runaway code take over and degrade experience across the board. Okay, so before we wrap up, you want to probably...
I know, I'm waiting for it to load up to finish advancing.
Okay. So while she loads up, moves, yeah, there you go. So one of the common questions that come up is like, hey, how do we roll out a portal or app? And this is a common question that comes up. I have been lucky enough to be part of portals that are 100,000 users strong and how we've rolled them out. So I'll share a couple of best practices here. So if you want to go next. So one of the common things, questions we hear is like, hey, I have 100,000 users. I'm going to send an email out Monday morning saying, here's our new portal. Let's go party on it. And what we see, and a lot of customers are concerned, and they should be, is the amount of users you send that email to, or you ask them to come visit the portal, is always much, much, much higher than users who actually show up on that day. So make sure that you plan appropriately. The other thing you want to do is, how do you roll out? Do not roll out in a big bang. We've had cases where we have 100,000 users, we've gone big bang. And in many cases, the Microsoft infrastructure is fine. We've seen on-premises network actually become the bottleneck. So the right way, where we've seen, or the appropriate way, where we've seen we've had great success with large portals, is phased rollout. So we recommend going out in phases, starting with a pilot, where you spend extended amount of time with a group of users piloting your portal or your app. If you are a geographically distributed organizations, make sure you have users who have been brought in from all geographies, who you trust to give you feedback, not only on performance, but also the functionality, the features, is it all as per design? Roll out to a smaller audience after that once you've done the verification, validation. Most often than not, you would make some tweaks and then go out to a pilot, broader pilot. Again, get users running for a while, get feedback, and you want to do that progressively till you saturate out your user base. I've seen customers who have done pilot 10% and 90%, doesn't work because you probably are going to run into some bottleneck at the higher percentages. So stage it out, and you probably will have a sense of when you think you're ready to dial the knob all the way out to 100%. Phased rollout has always been successful. Both within Microsoft, we do that, and also with large customers who have got portals with 100,000 users plus, have been successful in rolling this out. So just to summarize, if you are starting new, or you are building a new portal, or you're moving from on-premises to the cloud, go modern. All the tips and tricks we showed you are baked into the modern platform. You don't need to worry about navigation. The navigation provider in modern is more scaled out and built for the cloud. It's built for the cloud first. CDNs, again, it's baked into the platform. You don't need to worry about it. File size optimization, it's all available in modern. So if you are starting new, go modern. Now, we do know that there are a lot of customers who have invested in classic portal. And while they transition over to modern, take the time. Some of the tricks we showed you today are not time consuming. It will help your users have a good experience while you transition over to modern. And then finally, I can't stress this enough, please follow a phased rollout. It will be to the success of your projects.
Yeah, and then from an app perspective, just a few things to think about with these. For Go Modern, use Graph and SharePoint Framework and follow best practices as much as possible in your modern portals. Really thinking about using the new things that have been coming out, that are being released, that are continually being updated and expanded further to really give you the best performance possible. And that comes across apps as well as in branding. And again, optimize on Classic. Really, if you are using Classic, make sure you're following the best practices. If you're using on-premises or you're in a Classic mode, make sure you're following our best practices. We did give you a couple of links here up on the page. SPO429 is a great one if you're running in Classic or you're having slow performance to start looking at, as well as the aka.ms/tunespo. Great resources to go in and look at. And it's really great to do some of that testing with your custom applications. So where Shyam talked a lot about rolling out your portals in phases. Do test and pilot test custom applications that you're putting out to make sure that they don't have a broad impact that you're not aware of. A lot of times we build custom apps and then we run them in our dev box and they work great, right? And then we roll them out to 20 people and they are so slow that nobody can use it, or it causes the page to roll out really slow and to load really slowly. So that phased rollout isn't just for our portals. It's really making sure we pilot and we test our custom applications beyond just ourselves or our small developer team. Get a bigger group of people, especially if it's something I'm using across my entire tenant. Make sure you test it and do that phased rollout.
And just to touch on, aka.ms/tunespo basically has all the best practices we spoke about with code samples and detailed information. So if you are on Classic, do spend some time on their website.
So we did leave a little bit of time for questions at the end. We wanted to make sure that if any of you were experiencing these kinds of things or had questions, that we wanted to have some time for that. We want to say thank you for coming. Really appreciate it. We hope you've had a great SharePoint conference and that you're sticking around at the end of the day today for the big Ask Me Anything that's happening at the end of the day, and we hope to see you there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.